Hello and welcome to the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Denison Associates. Denison Associates is an ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. Hello, my name is Jonathan Donald, the founder of Invert Ventures, a change strategy firm. I'm here with my co-host, friend, and colleague, Dr. Jack Nessel, the founder of Denison Associates. The ERP Organizational Change Journal seeks to share expertise, insight, and create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success, expanding what we can see so we can act in a more effective way. We seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP and organizational change community. The primary purpose of the podcast is to discuss, share, reflect upon effective and efficient ways in which to realize ERP organizational change success. We will discuss the people, processes, and technological components of ERP organizational change. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change. It is intended to be a collaboration tool and resource. We hope that you will find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, best practices, and explore the human elements of ERP organizational change. Our podcast draws on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, practitioner experience, critically of both project successes and project failures. A general review of the themes of ERP and organizational change practices, literature, and research suggests that understanding and critically having an awareness of tactical approaches founded in principle is fundamental to ERP organizational change success. Our podcast will explore these tactics, approaches, and the principles that they're based on to be a useful tool in addressing ERP organizational change challenges and risks. Jack?
Thank you, Jonathan. And as usual, I'm happy to have you co-hosting with us today. As we are a podcast that desires to engage in valuable insight into the world of ERP organizational change success with interviews and roundtable talk, our guests include experts and pioneers in the field, organizational stakeholders, practitioners, and researchers, and a discussion of any and all things ERP organizational change. Our podcast is a platform for those seeking to share, learn, and reflect on ERP organizational change. So in this episode, Achieve Organizational Culture Change Success, we will discuss how effective change happens with our guest, Dr. Daniel Denison. Dr. Denison is chairman and founding partner at Denison Consulting. And beginning in 1998, Denison's global practice grew from a set of diagnostic assessments rooted in their research, linking organizational culture and leadership to business performance. And the Denison team builds on this base of research. Dr. Denison's consulting practice partners with clients across the globe to address their organizational culture and leadership challenges. And for over the past 25 years, Dr. Denison has advanced the field of organizational development and is one of its leading scholars, practitioners, and teachers. His work has made many contributions to the understanding of organizational culture and its relationship to the bottom line business success. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the Denison model of organizational culture, which is the basis for one of the industry's leading organizational culture assessments tools. Dr. Denison's research has shown a strong relationship between organizational culture and business performance metrics, such as profitability, growth, customer satisfaction, and innovation. In addition, Dr. Denison has consulted with many leading corporations regarding organizational change, leadership development, and the cultural issues associated with mergers and acquisitions, turnarounds, and globalization. From 1999 to 2016, Dr. Denison was professor of management and organization at the International Institute for Management Development, IMD, in Switzerland. Dan was an associate professor of organizational behavior and human resource management at the University of Michigan Business School. Having lived, taught, and consulted in Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America, the Pacific Rim, and the Middle East, and the Far East, Dr. Denison brings a broad understanding and breadth of experience to his clients worldwide. And we're happy to have him with us today.
Absolutely. Dr. Denison's latest book that he co-authored with his colleagues at IMD is Leading Cultural Change in Global Organizations, Aligning Culture and Strategy. He's a frequent speaker at professional conferences, is widely published in leading journals, and has contributed chapters to many books. We're going to explore deeply in this podcast the insights of Dr. Denison and his co-authors, Robert Hoiberg, Nancy Lane, and Colleen Leaf, in their latest book.
Great. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Dr. Denison, as a pioneer in the field, having advanced the study of organizational development, and as one of its leading scholars, practitioners, and researchers, I admire your work and commitment to organizational success. In my own practice, in my own study, in my own research, I quote and reference your work frequently. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you join us today.
Oh, the pleasure is mine, Jack and Jonathan. I'm glad to be a part of this. It's an interesting set of topics, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Dr. Denison, before we jump into it, I just want to go over a few of the themes that we'll be going through for our listeners as well. First, we're going to look at what is organizational culture and have a few questions there. And then one of the assumptions is, in order to work with organizational culture, we need to see it. And so we're going to explore ways on which we can become visible to culture in our organizations. Then we're going to look at working with culture once we can see it. And then at an individual level, what are the ways that we as individual leaders or practitioners or people in organizations can influence culture? We're so excited for this fascinating conversation. And again, thank you for joining us. So to start us off, I wanted to set the context that in one of your earlier articles in the late 80s, you explore that the primary and fundamental identity of an organization is based on its organizational culture. And that includes its set of values, beliefs, and behavioral patterns. To open up this conversation for our listeners, what in your view is organizational culture?
Good question. And, that's the place to start. I think in a lot of ways, our colleague Tom Peters said it best. He said, culture is the way we do things around here. Any human group, from a family to a nation, a company, a community, learns over time a set of principles and values, beliefs, behavior patterns. Those are all part of it. But they learn a set of lessons that they believe are important to pass on to the next generation. That builds up over time. And so it's the way that we've, identified and that we've built over time to work together. And it means that the contradictions that are in any organization, we've found a way to work with those. The challenges that are, unique to our business, our industry, the lessons from that are part of the organization culture. It has some interesting implications. One of the most powerful is that it's kind of rooted in what's worked in the past.
Yeah.
And when we have times of rapid change, like maybe 2020, what's worked in the past isn't necessarily any guarantee to work in the future. So from a leadership point of view, it's always how do you anticipate what will be needed? How not only how do we do things around here, but how do we need to do things around here next year or next month or next decade if we're going to continue to be successful?
Fantastic. So really, it's more than those values and beliefs. It's the fundamental space of the way we do things around here. And
and one of the things that we developed out of our book is that a lot of it has to do with habits and routines.
Yeah.
And we found that was a really, really helpful way of leading the discussion because culture can be, I admit, kind of like a 30,000, foot kind of concept, or 10,000 meters, depending upon what part of the world you're in.
Sure.
The challenge is like landing the plane, not cruising around at altitude. And habits and routines are a terrific way to bring it down to earth, because everyone in an organization has their own routines, their own kind of mindset, leadership, behavior, the system that they work in. And some of those are much better suited to the past. We want to leave them in the past. They're bad old habits, as we call them. And some of them are good old habits. That's the foundation that made the organization successful. Then we need to do things that are new. We need to develop some good new habits. You move into a new geography, a new line of business. You got to take out a white sheet of paper and design what the organization is going to be. And we don't always get that right. You know, a lot of your focus is on ERP, and in explaining our habits model that has like good new habits that we need to develop, but then also bad new habits that we took the first step, but we didn't get it right the first time. People scratch their head and say, what's that about? And I always ask them, any of you ever do an SAP implementation? And they all say, yeah. All the hands go up. Then you say, how many of you got it right the first time? All the hands go back down. Except for the guy that was the project leader. He usually keeps his hand up. But when you ask him the question, you usually find out he was the third project leader because the first two didn't get it right the first time. So the whole business of creating the business processes and the habits and the routines that enable the business model is always a key concern of building a culture.
Right. So, Dr. Denison, the next question kind of touches on that point, but it's around the idea of organizational culture's relationship with strategy. You mentioned before that, quote, strategy without action is simply an intention to do something, unquote. I forget which one of your papers I read that, but so how do leaders know if the strategy is motivating the intended action and having the desired impact? Can you maybe just discuss maybe even generally that solution and for that effect or for that process to be effective?
Sure. I mean, strategy, our culture eats strategy for either breakfast or lunch. There's some difference between Mark Fields and Peter Drucker and, Jack Welch and all the people that are credited with that. But, if you found a way to implement a strategy without changing the mindset, the leadership, the systems of an organization, please, I ask your listeners to call me, let me know, because a lot of the work that we do is around strategy implementation, strategy alignment. Suppose you've got a business that's been a product business, you're an engineering company, but your customers expect solutions. Yeah. It's easy to say that. Right. It's extremely hard to implement. And on the other side, too, some that have been in solutions want to have more product-based revenue that's not so linked to the labor involved, SaaS business models. How do you implement a strategy without a change in mindset and behavior? I don't think you can. And a lot of our work, that's one of our four main practice areas, is strategic alignment. You find so many examples where the top two levels of the organization get the new strategy. Beyond that, it's anybody's guess. They're still working on the last strategy and implementing that, not the new one. And so, leaders need to be in touch with the front line. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Denison. I apologize. But you had mentioned, I just want to share with our readers these 4 points that you were just referring to. So from your book, Leading Culture Change in Global Organizations, Aligning Culture and Strategy, you stated that, quote, research over the past 2 or 3 decades has shown that an organization's culture has an impact on business performance in 4 main ways. 1, creating an organization's sense of mission and direction. 2, building a high level of adaptability and flexibility. 3, nurturing the involvement and engagement of their people. And 4, providing a consistency that is strongly rooted in a set of core values. So how could you, just to drill down a little bit further for our listeners, how do we break this down into, I guess, brass tacks, so to speak, or the application of this idea within the 4 walls of an organization?
Yeah, those 4 traits are the core of our model that we use for the assessment process for both organizations and for their leaders. Mission and adaptability focus our attention outside of the organization in how the organization adapts to its environment. Involvement and consistency focus our attention internally. And as our colleague and friend Edgar Schein said, culture is about solving 2 problems at the same time: external adaptation and internal integration. In those 4 areas, in mission, we measure things like vision, strategy, goals and objectives. In adaptability, we look at the customer focus, creating change in response to the environment and organizational learning. In involvement, we look at capability development, team orientation, and the level of empowerment and engagement. And then for consistency, we look at coordination, the ability to reach agreement, and the core values of the organization. So out of the research that showed that those were the 4 predictors of performance in terms of profitability, growth, safety, customer satisfaction, market value, those are the things that were the best predictors from our research and from a lot of other people's research as well. So that's what we measure both at the organization level and at the leadership capability level. We use the same approach at both of those levels, which gives us 2 important points of leverage trying to change organizations and help them build for the future.
Dr. Denison, I find myself nodding in agreement with basically everything you're saying. You can't see it, but I have a big smile on my face.
Me too.
One of the things here, right, and we're going to switch a little bit because the introduction you gave to organizational culture and its ability using the 12 sub-pillars that you measure and its relation to effectiveness was so perfect. Oftentimes what I'm seeing in organizations is that they cannot see those things in real time. And so I want to focus you and ask you, with the Denison model and the tension between adaptability and consistency, mission and involvement, all around belief, assumptions, and those behaviors, how can we use the Denison model to actually see what's happening in the organization and take that 30,000 or 10,000 meter plane and really make it real in the boardroom, at the frontline level, at the management level? Can you speak to that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think one of our contributions, which I wish I could claim I saw clear as a bell, 20 years ago or something, is that it's a way to frame, the model is a way to frame a really complex issue.
Yeah.
How do you build the culture, the values, the ethics of an organization over time in a way that helps you adapt and thrive? And that's a pretty challenging thing to do. And, what we've found is that, you have to have all 4 of those traits to be an effective high-performance organization. And that the assessment process helps because our model also focuses on a pretty limited slice of culture.
Sure.
Because we focus on the things that are most likely to have an important impact on the performance of a business. Lots of other things go into that. But, one time early on, we did an analysis of an organization. We presented the results to the leadership team, and it showed that they were very internally focused, didn't concentrate on the customer, managed in goals and numbers quarter to quarter, no vision, no strategy. Their people were quite disengaged. I put up the model, which is a colored pie chart, showing how they compared to their competition. And one of the top executives gave a big sigh and said, "Yeah, that's us." And, I almost said, "Wait a minute, no, it's not you. It's a colored pie chart." But presenting some data that speak to how the culture best supports or most limits their business strategy, that opened up their eyes And it also is designed around things that are quite actionable. We measure many things like employee engagement, commitment, trust, safety, risk, diversity, and digitalization are big growth areas for us now. But the core of it is about the organization as a system that's owned by all the leaders of the organization and by all the organization. And what we found is that by just putting that on the table in front of them and saying, what do you think? What's that mean to you? What's behind this? What are the biggest gaps? That can help mobilize the momentum for organizations to change.
Dr. Denison, I'm struck by the idea that I'm hearing, and I just want to make this overt for our listeners, that the act of seeing organizational culture by doing the Denison survey is actually two things. It's both a snapshot of those 12 key metrics and how the organization works, but as your story illustrates, it's also the first intervention by making something that is invisible visible and intangible tangible. And that act in itself is that first start.
Yeah, and in many of our projects, we start with a pretty extensive discovery process where we interview all the executives. We get their perspective on the challenges, and we focus on the one question: why is the culture of the organization important to the business performance? And, that's a different story in every organization. Yeah, we can't, recruit enough biochemists unless we, change the business model of our pharma company. We need more people that are solutions sales people. Millennials are a challenge. We can't respond enough to our most innovative customers. There's a long, long list of insights about why the culture is important. If people say, hey, we need to do a survey by the end of the year. Okay, why? Well, my boss told me to. Well, why? Well, because his boss told her to. And the discussion of why are you doing this? And what's the plan for how you're going to shape the culture for the future? That's really important, because then that next big step is to say, okay, and here's our analysis. This shows that you're really very clear on goal, but no vision, or the vision only goes down 2 levels in the organization, or you're responsive to the environment but don't really take any suggestions from the customer. Trying to clarify the kind of cultural underpinnings of the significant business problems that they're trying to address.
Interesting. Yeah. So Dr. Denison, as you know, I'm all about applied research, and I know that you and your team for over 20 years, Denison has been a leader in culture and leadership. And in my mind, that's because you have a tool that works. It's effective.
Yeah.
And, you're working with over 7,000 organizations. You've developed a best-in-class research and assessment methodologies to help organizations drive that change and boost performance. So let's see if my question makes sense here. So we described your model, but for our listeners, is there a way, or can you just generally explain the science behind your approach? Is there anything more you can?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I started out trying to understand if there were significant performance differences between high involvement organizations and low involvement organizations. And way back, we found pretty clearly that the profitability of high involvement organizations was 2.5 times as high as low involvement organizations. So culture is not something that's nice to have. It's something that's kind of core to your success. And we've just continued doing that research both to kind of support these 4 traits of mission, adaptability, involvement, and consistency, to measure those and look at those in really dozens of different studies at this point. And really what we found was that the externally facing factors of mission and adaptability were the strongest predictors of growth, and the internal focused traits of involvement and consistency were, better as predictors of operating performance and not necessarily growth. We've continued that research with a leadership model on leader performance. We've done studies with growth, with market value, and customer satisfaction. We published a study a couple of years ago that won a bunch of awards because it was one of the first time series studies ever done in this area, and showed that there is an answer to the chicken and egg story, and that culture is a leading indicator. What goes around comes around. So you do see higher performance organizations can invest more, especially in areas like involvement and capability. But in general, culture is not an outcome of success. It's a driver of success.
Sure.
And so that's some of the, you should know better than to ask a professor emeritus to talk about their research in a forum that's less than 3 hours long, but that's enough, I mean.
That's great.
I used to always joke that when I was teaching executives at IMB that I wanted to, I want people to know the research is there, but, I always joke, if they want to know more about the research, go to our website. There's dozens of studies there, and believe me, some of them will put you to sleep in about 5 minutes. If I've got a group of executives that are badly jet lagged, I always say, don't worry, that'll put you to sleep, because those time series equations, those will make you nod out. A lot of detail. We've done our homework for years in this area. But that's all just to say, this model's pointing us in the right direction in terms of assuring. Because leaders are charged with assuring the success of their shareholders for their people. They don't have a lot of time to win that. We want to make sure we're pointing them in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly.
Dr. Denison, taking those principles and that research and making it practical and usable is exactly what this podcast is about. So you're in the right place, and I can assure you, there's not a chance the equations are putting us to sleep. What I do want to highlight here before we move to the next question is you said something that I find incredibly powerful, which is that culture is a driver of business success and performance. And I want to relate this to what you said earlier when we were talking about the question of culture is not just to do a cultural survey to have it, but what are you trying to do in your business? What are you trying to break through to? That culture is a lens, a tool, and a support. And there's something very powerful in viewing it as that core driver that your research shows it is. I just wanted to highlight that and give you a chance to make that point for our listeners.
Yeah, a key part of our engagement process, what we do in our relationship with firms is all of the diagnostic work. The purpose is to drive what we call a set of honest conversations.
Yeah.
Where, at the top of the organization, but also at the top of, business units, geographies, functions, even cross levels, the data is used to facilitate a set of honest conversations about the organization, the strength, the challenges, and to really reinforce the process that the people make the place. That's a title of an article a colleague and friend Ben Schneider wrote years ago. But over time, for sure, where does an organization come from? It comes from the actions of individuals, and trying to draw as many people into the discussion of how the organization's adapting to the competitive business environment that they're in. That's always the purpose of our work. Sometimes we'll have hundreds of kind of small group discussions about the results, both for the organization as a whole and for the part of the organization that each group is in, because we're trying to identify priorities and opportunities for change at all levels and put those under the umbrella of a set of changes needed for the corporation as a whole, but also to emphasize the fact that each piece of the organization has a role to play.
Yeah, that fundamental process I would call breakthrough for an organization. And it's so important right now.
It definitely can be. It can really change their perspective. You know, we're doing an article now on the organization that creates barcodes. Yep. Anybody make it through the day without a barcode today? I can't. We can't go anyplace. And we'll have a webcast with the CEO coming up in a few weeks. We'll make sure you guys know about, and that others are aware of too, because they sort of didn't get it at first. It was really kind of interesting. It took a while for it to stick, but you know, they've worked with us every year for the past 10 years.
Yeah,
because they see the importance of managing that.
And one of the things that brought me into this space is that when you look at transformations across the board, the number ranges anywhere from 60 to 75%, depending on who you're citing, but that large-scale transformations fail to meet their expected results. And this includes major system implementations, this includes transformational programs, cultural changes. And one of the big things that's coming out of the research is that cultural factors, particularly their incompatibility or a cultural clash, is one of the major drivers of these failures. And you often see these in mergers and acquisitions where the synergy costs are immediately written out of the deal, and large-scale consulting firms are brought in to manage that change process. And there's so many factors and variables here that can affect a culture clash. But can you speak about the role of culture in assuring that we can increase project success for those large-scale transformations? And how much of a tool do you think that is?
It makes me think of, Thomas Edison, innovation is simple. It's 99%, it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration.
Yeah.
I would say it's similar with that in strategy formulation and strategy implementation. Wouldn't it be a blast here if, all of us, business school professors and consultants and top executives just could assume implementation? Here's a brilliant, let's assume an implementation. And my God, if you go around asking the question about what's the governance process for the implementation of your new strategy?
One of my favorites.
People go, huh? What, governance strategy? Well, how are you going to implement the strategy? How are you going to track the implementation and the understanding? The market, it would really be a beautiful world if the market paid returns to unimplemented strategies. But it doesn't. Okay? It pays returns to the strategies that you implement. And doing that without culture change or some culture awareness, I keep hoping, I get up every morning, but I've never seen that. I've never seen it. A significant strategy change always means a substantial culture change, and the implementation process and the governance of the strategy implementation process really very often doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
If it exists at all. I want to quickly invert that question for you, because I think there's something here incredibly valuable, which is, if this is such an important driver of success, why do you think that it's not talked about? Why do you think that there's a bias to not seeing culture in organizations today?
Great question.
Well, it's like the old joke about it's hard to remember to make a note to yourself to drain the swamp when you're up to your ass in alligators,
My gosh.
You might want to censor that out, but
no, that's staying.
But I should confess that I think I've probably learned more about culture and leadership from running our own company for 20 years than from all the research. Everybody has a lot of expertise in that, but executives that focus both on the here and now, the next step, as well as where they're going, over the next 5 or 10 years, that's really an art that I admire. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Every step counts. And keeping your eye on both the long term and the short term at the same time is the trick. We get real focused, and organizations don't thrive without hundreds, without thousands of people that are working on a very short time frame. They know how to deliver. They know how to hit the goals. They know how to hit the targets. They know how to make the numbers. And, but combining that with the bigger picture insight into what kind of organization are we going to create for the future that's going to allow us to be a magnet for the best people in our industry and for the best customers in our industry and the best technology, so that we're going to create a virtuous cycle of innovation here. It's hard to look both long-term and short-term at the same time without getting pretty cross-eyed.
Right.
It's a big challenge. And, there are lots of organizations that are so busy, planning what's going to happen in the next, 5 years that they forget about what's happened in the next 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You can't give short shrift to the short term. We got to keep both of those in mind. One time I was been in Ann Arbor, Michigan for years and had the city as a client much times. One time I was doing a workshop with people in the city from all over the city government. And there's a guy in there in bib overalls that I'm talking about this long-term, short-term thing, and he's getting purple. His face, his veins in his neck are like bulging. And I said, well, Henry, what's on your mind? And he says, yeah, long-term, short-term, you bet. And I said, well, why? Your work, why is that important? He says, well, suppose the water main goes out in the middle of the night on Plymouth Road. If I don't know the long-term development plan, when I can decide, am I going to fix this till morning? Am I going to fix this for, the next month? Or am I going to fix this forever? Because if I don't know that development plan, I got to wake up my boss in the middle of the night. And so you've got to have both eyes on the short term and the long term.
There's such inherent tension in being able to do that. And I get a sense that your cultural model is designed to visibly describe that internal tension between external and internal focus and stability and flexibility. And before you answer, I want to just shift slightly because we have such a space around now what we can actually use to see it and why it's important. And I want to take that question and really ask you, how do we work with it?
Mm-hmm. I think the most important part of working with it is understanding kind of a co-creation model of change. You'd think that by now people would have sort of learned that hiring the consultant to come in and tell you what to do and then leaving for you to do it is really not enough. It's interesting because organizations will ask me, well, based on this, what do you think we should do about our strategy? And and I kind of bite my tongue because what I really want to ask is, how much do they pay you guys? Because, what are your ideas about that? What have you tried? What's worked? Where are the limitations? Our work's designed to create a dialogue in the organization that wasn't there before. Out of that, you'll see the opportunities and you'll see the range of options that people consider. And you'll also get a good feel for what's feasible, what's viable, what's been tried, what worked, what didn't work, so they decide as a team how they want to move forward together. And it's interesting because a lot of organizations will say, well, hey, look, we just want to increase our score on organizational learning by 20 percentile points for next year. And it's like, well, okay, that's a good goal, but how are you going to do that? What is the underlying change that you're going to make that's going to drive that? And, a lot of times they'll say, well, we'll just try to get a higher response rate on the survey next time, or we'll coach people about, here's all the great stuff we've done. And it's like, no, use the pattern of results to identify the key points of leverage that you think are going to help build the momentum for change. One of the examples in the book is one from GE Healthcare in China, the anesthesia business, and I showed the results to the the managing director, and he said, "Oh, this is great. I know exactly what to do." And I thought, well, what? He said, "Well, we need to do more of what we're already doing." And I said, "Yeah, tell me more." And what he was saying was he was reacting to the fact that the results showed that there was a real limit to vision and purpose. There was a lack of connection to the customer, and there were real challenges in capability development. And he said, "Perfect. This last year we started taking some of our electronic engineers into the operating room." This is a company that made anesthesia machines, so that they could see them in action. They could understand that woman on the table was somebody's grandmother, could be your grandmother, and that's a higher sense of purpose. It helped them to understand in China it's the same. There's the patient, there's the doctor, there's the institution, the hospital, who pays for it. All of those are customers. And furthermore, they positioned this as a way to attract better talent. So that one action, sending all the engineers into the operating room for a half day each year, that was something that addressed a number of those different issues at the same time. So picking what we call keystone habits that are, key habits that can really help build the momentum for change, because organizations change because one change leads to 3 more. Those 3 lead to 6 or 9 more. And picking the point of intervention, given all that you learned from the diagnosis, all the points of discussion, that's where you create the most change in an organization.
Sure. So Dr. Denison, maybe this is more of a comment than a question, but at Nestle & Associates, we do a great deal of merger and acquisition, IT and ERP assessments. And of course, for those folks, for those listeners not familiar with private equity, when you purchase an organization, there's a period where you do your due diligence in terms of, IT, ERP, but also legal, financial, and operational due diligence, right? You do all the proper work, right? So you can make a good business investment and a good decision as to whether or not that acquisition is appropriate. But you talk about cultural due diligence. And my personal opinion is that every PE acquisition should include an organizational cultural due diligence due to all the great points that you just previously mentioned, right? So we know that culture is just so critical, and it's really the glue that holds many pieces together, right? So shouldn't we take its temperature and measure it as we would financials or other operating metrics? And it's such a significant piece that in my mind, sometimes it's not on the checklist, and it should be. Any thoughts?
Sure. We've written several chapters about that in articles, and very important. When can you get access and how? Prior to acquisition, especially with larger companies where there is a social media presence, particularly companies that have kind of Glassdoor type of data, we've actually done social media analysis of data sources that you can access even while you're looking at 5 different companies. You can also, spend quite a bit of time talking with people that are knowledgeable in the industry, that have experience with the organization. And you can also look at a lot of the data that they already have internally. You can't go in and say, hey, we're thinking about acquiring you. Don't you want to take this cool culture survey when you're in the stage of, making an offer and of deciding the valuation? A lot of that direct work of doing an assessment, needs to come after you close the deal, soon after you close the deal. But the important thing is just that you keep the issue of the culture on the table. I don't think that it's very often a one-factor, don't do this deal, although there's some good examples of that. But I do think it's very important in terms of the investment of time and the challenge of the implementation and the integration. And certainly after you make the deal, then you got to really go to work on doing this, because you're acquiring a new set of ideas, a new mindset, and you've got to work with that and build a hybrid and decide where you need to integrate and coordinate and where you need to give lots of independence and grow kind of a new subculture in the organization.
Right. And almost by definition, a lot of times, PE firms don't buy acquire organizations to stay the same, right? They're
That's
motivated to improve business. So almost by definition, organizational culture, and of course, maybe technology and processes change, but in order to do that successfully, usually requires a change in organizational mindset and culture.
That's right.
So from your experience in evaluating hundreds of organizations, throughout the globe, what do you see as the missing most in leadership development, especially in regards to guiding organizational change?
Well, I think that most organizations, they recruit, they promote, they coach for kind of filling the existing slots and preserving the status quo. Then when you get into the job, you understand that you have very rapid change going on. And I think that the hardest part about coaching is understanding the context, understanding the culture of the organization that someone is supposed to perform within, and building that gap between the individual's capability and the organization's needs, focusing on that gap so that leadership development and organizational change are more closely integrated. Particularly in larger organizations, a lot of places, they don't even really, talk to each other or like each other very much, because the leadership guys do individual assessment, and the OD guys do organization change. And they don't connect as much as they should, because there's really a lot of leverage in structuring leadership development to focus on the challenges of tomorrow, not fitting into today.
Dr. Denison, I can't nod more with that answer. I feel like my head's about to fall off, especially the lack of alignment within the transformational resources. And this relates to your early point about governance. Right. I want to jump into a different level of scale here. As individuals and leaders within companies, like consultants and ERP practitioners, trust in leadership is such an important concept. And you talk about this in your book. The focus on building a high-performance culture is increasing in many companies. But one of the critical levers we have is the need to build trust through collective leadership. And you said it beautifully before with the co-creative process. And for those who are in organizations at multiple levels of scale, what are some tactical ways they can do this? How can they use themselves as an instrument to build that in their organizations?
I think the most interesting part about the trust research and experience with it is how critical vulnerability is to the building of trust.
Yeah.
We don't trust people where we don't see that they share some vulnerability as well. When you get some, overlap in your vulnerability and my vulnerability, then we begin to kind of plan together. And where you see no vulnerability, trust is hard to build. I think that's always a key. And understanding that there's an emotional side to trust that's very important, but sometimes is overplayed. There's a reliability, consistency, and follow-through component to trust that is really, really important. But I think that vulnerability is the hardest part about that, because, we all want to not show that we have any vulnerability at all. It's our first choice, really, most of the time.
Sure. So then the tactic here is how do we cultivate the space to allow others to be vulnerable?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And how do you kind of allow that? And how do you model that? How do top executives model that? Because some of them are amazingly good at it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And modeling is such an important lever that we have in organizations and in ourselves to demonstrate that organizational culture.
One of my favorite examples of a leader was a Brazilian guy in the Finnish company Metso. Metso is a company that makes equipment for the mining industry. And this guy had the most magical touch at describing, a real challenge, a mess, really a kind of a life-threatening situation in terms of the business, laying all that out there and using that to mobilize people and to draw in people's attention. It was really interesting because that all started with really a pretty profound presentation of his vulnerability as a business leader, and it worked too.
So, Dr. Denison, in concluding our time together today, I do have one more question, and I'm going to quote a statement from my own dissertation work in which I said, organizational culture and organization-related influences are necessary to understand because, as described by Denison and colleagues, 2003, organizational culture characteristics, which can be measured and monitored, may have a predictable impact on the effectiveness of organizational change. If this is a true statement, which we know it is, why do you suppose more organizations don't place higher value in understanding and measuring these characteristics? At least in my view, I think there's lots of room for improvement here. Any thoughts on that?
I think that people struggle with the logic of their organization and the rate of change and the mindset of their individual leaders. I think it is one of those topics where it's like everybody's an expert in this, and that's not untrue at all. I mean, I've learned, a whole lot of what I've learned has come from being in front of groups of very experienced people that are absolutely experts in this. But, that often means that they don't have a common approach to it. They don't have the discussion where they spend the time in aligning for action. And I think that's an investment of time. I'm working with a client right now where they've got a great new strategy. The market's responded really well. The analysts like it. The complexity and the coordination required to really implement that has the top leaders really scratching their heads and starting to understand the complexity of what they've gotten themselves into. But as you go down a layer or two more in the organization, hey, everybody's just trying to hit the P&L in their part of the shop. And so, hey, guys, we've got a humongous coordination task ahead of us. Put that one on hold for a minute, that P&L. But you do have to deliver by the end of the year, Get us those numbers. But, by the way, we need a transformation plan, too. That goes back to this, the strain between the short term and the long term and just how profound that can be.
Sure. So I think, there's organizations from my experience, they're absolutely experts. I mean, there's a lot of people that know a lot about organizational culture. Even within organizations, what I see a lot, and one of the things we place a lot of value on is this idea of creating this idea of mission and vision and value. But, that's one thing, right? That might be a piece of paper on the wall or a poster, and it means something. It's valuable. But then to be able to tactically change and to align with that is incredibly important, right? You got to go beyond that a couple of board meetings where you talk about the value of communicating a mission. And so I think that the key is, like you said, it's incredibly challenging tactically, as we discussed here earlier on in this podcast. But then I also think that you have to attempt to measure it. So no matter how much you know about organizational culture, no matter how much you talk about it or value it, it's really important that you actually assess it in using a tool that works, so that you can see what, you can take my temperature now and you can take it in 2 months from now to make sure I'm feeling better, right? And so, I think that's a very important idea in organizational change, is understanding what it means, what it is, the value of alignment and some of these other characteristics that we talked about. But it's also just as important as assessing and having some way to measure that, so you have proof in the pudding that, hey, we definitely have an issue here. We're not aligned on risk management. So how do we work past that? Because, by the way, especially in ERP, organizational change, that risk management piece is critical to success.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really easy to underestimate the complexity of the changes. And top executives are like they're thinking about the industry. They're thinking about the future. They think fast. And the discipline of understanding the depth of the change in mindset that it takes to really succeed. It's always worth executives' time to invest in that and to develop a system. Because if you don't measure, how do you achieve accountability without a way to measure? How do you achieve a system where you got some long-term staying power if there's no, measures that you could take? Right. And I think that's an area where our work and your work have made a big contribution because, creating innovative ways to measure fairly intangible things is really moving fast these days. And understanding, here's a good thought to leave you with. What do we know about how you create a culture for an organization in a virtual environment where nobody's ever met face to face? Okay, that's going to take some time. Somebody that can get an app and somebody that can double click on that and solve it all by the end of the week. Hey, they're going to be busy. And really, it's very interesting because most executives I've asked that to, they just say, "Oh yeah, wow, that's like," and hey, we got a lot of things we need to take care of. We'll get back to that one, but I've yet to find either a corporation or a group of researchers that are actually trying to understand that and articulate how to do it. And I think it's one of the most important business issues of our time.
Yeah. Great insight. Great point. Well, Dr. Denison, thank you so much for your time today. We truly appreciate your work. For our listeners, please check out DenisonConsulting.com for more great information and for some great resources and literature. It's something that I refer to often. And we highly recommend that for anyone serious about effective leadership, that leading culture change in global organizations, aligning culture and strategy is in your library. It's a great piece of work, a great book. So Dr. Denison, thank you so much, and we appreciate it, and be well, my friend.
You too. Thanks so much for the opportunity. You guys take care, and we'll talk again soon.
We will. What an amazing conversation, Dr. Denison. Thank you for your insight. This was truly enjoyable on all levels.
Thanks, guys. You take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We are incredibly excited and grateful to have our friends, colleagues, and mentors join us on our podcast. We have an incredible lineup of ERP and organizational change speakers, authors, professors, researchers, pioneers in the field, practitioners, PE partners, business executives, ERP vendors, and organizational stakeholders. So please join us in our next episode as Paul Magel joins us to discuss the benefits of industry-specific ERP platforms and emerging technologies in ERP. Paul is the president of Application Solution Group, Blue Cherry ERP, and Computer Generated Solutions, Inc. He brings years of experience and practice to our podcast in terms of ERP software development and implementation practices. This is going to be a conversation focused at the tech part of the triad. Paul has more than 3 decades of experience in the information technology space, leading the Application Solution Division at CGS. Mr. Magel oversees the company flagship Blue Cherry Enterprise Suites, the solution for the fashion, apparel, and consumer lifestyle product industry, as well as the technological and infrastructure practice overseeing sales, delivery, support, and development. Paul is also responsible for the CGS Global Software Development Centers in India and Europe, and that includes the recent expansion of Blue Cherry Solutions to Europe and Canada. For more than 10 years, Mr. Magel has served on the International Trade and Marketing, ITM, Advisory Board for the Fashion Institute of Technology, FIT at SUNY. He also serves on the selection committee for the Polo Ralph Lauren New Times Group Scholarship, awarded to students with a strong scholastic record and visible volunteer work at ITM at FIT, the industry and the community. He's a noted speaker at such industry programs as the Apparel Executive Conference and the AAFA Executive Summit. He's been interviewed and quoted on a number of topics ranging from sustainability to retail and supply chain solutions in such publications as WWD, The Observer, Retail Drive, E-Commerce Times, Supply Chain Executive, and the CIO. I hope you join us for a fascinating conversation with Paul, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us as we seek to 1, promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community, 2, contribute to the field of ERP organizational change, and 3, bring research and practice closer together. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. Our podcast will draw on the knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience.
Bye for now.